Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about possibly the next revolution in gels and carbohydrate fueling. I think we speculated a few months ago about where this area would go, and it seems that we've reached the next step potentially. So we're going to break down the information that we can find about some of these new gels that are appearing both in running and in cycling. And especially at the time of recording, these are being mentioned on every day at the Tour de France, and about one specific team's use of them. So we thought we'll see what we can find about these and give our views. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, how are you going, Dan?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Owain. Yeah, I mean, I think it remains to be stand actually if it is the next thing or not. Like possibly or possibly not. I mean, we'll get to it later, but not a lot of research out there on the benefits of exogenous lactate as a fuel source. Does it aid performance? Some pretty mixed stuff in the literature, and even in the literature, there's not a lot there. So it's trying to pull apart, like a lot of things, the anecdotal stuff and the theory. So does it actually work? Is it actually going to help you go faster?
Yeah.
We're interested in the mechanism behind that, but I think a lot of people just want to know: will it help me? Will it help make the boat go faster? That's what they say, isn't it? That's the term, right?
That's the current term, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I guess before we get into it, as always, we're sponsored by SOAR. Just looking on what's new on SOAR, the trail race packs. We've mentioned these a few times, haven't we? We definitely keen to get our hands on a pack and give that a go whilst running. We were keen to look at maybe the energy cost of transporting your carbohydrates. Maybe you need less if you use these lactate gels, it seems. But yeah, transporting your equipment and your carbohydrates around races. There's obviously a lot of big trail races coming up at the moment, and having a pack is really essential for that because you have more than just some gels in your pocket. You have some pretty important gear. And yeah, the SOAR trail packs are really cool, as always, and they're going to be really well designed and tested as well. So definitely worth checking out. And they pair pretty well with some of the other garments on there as well. They're designed together, which is always pretty nice. You've not just got a bunch of garments in isolation and hope they work together on race day. They're all designed together. So yeah, definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, I think it's good they've put together those packages, haven't they? A race day package, training day package. You can pick a collection and get a nice discount on that as well. So yeah, definitely go and check out SOAR. I'm going to thank Currens for supporting the show. So if you're a runner focused on the finer details of performance, recovery, and long-term health, you'll want to know about Currens, a new powerhouse in polyphenol nutrition for endurance athletes. And actually, interestingly enough, we're going to talk a little bit about polyphenols later in the show. Currens is a New Zealand blackcurrant extract that's been recognized as European Sports Nutrition Product of the Year, and it's become a favorite among runners of all levels, from everyday marathon runner right through to elite ultra-distance athletes. It's backed by over 60 human trials. Currens has built a reputation in the running community for its broad-ranging research-led benefits. It's trusted by athletes who put their bodies under serious stress, including world 24-hour champion Sarah Webster. I used it myself in the run-up to my 2:11 marathon PB in Seville and generally felt a difference in terms of my rate of recovery and my consistency in training. Currens is easy to use, batch tested, and suitable for runners across the spectrum, whether you're training for your first 10K, chasing a marathon PB, or pushing limits in ultras. You can receive 15% off your first purchase using the code Physiology15. Apologies, I think last week I said Physiology20. It's Physiology15 is the code. And if you just head to currens.com, put in that code, you'll get 15% off your first order. Should we talk about some lactate?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, we talk about it every episode, don't we? In various forms. But yeah, I guess this is a new form, right? We're not talking about endogenous lactate. We're talking about exogenous lactate. So yeah, a bit of a different, what would you say? Production, or, where it's coming from, I guess.
I think I sort of first hit the headlines in the aftermath of London Marathon, where Kejelcha, second place, first marathon he runs 1:59, and came out afterwards, but he was using a Spanish nutrition company who have been using or trialing putting lactate into their gels. And let me just get my notes up here. And their specific gel. You got the name of it there?
Yeah, it's called Lactate 60, I want to say, but the company is called Santa Madre.
Santa Madre, that's it. Which I Google translated, and apparently is Holy Mother, which is an interesting name. But anyway, so they've got this gel, and it's a 40-gram gel in terms of carbohydrate and a 1-to-1 ratio between glucose and fructose, which is nothing new there. That's pretty typical of more than this SIS beta. They all tend to be either 1-to-1 or 1-to-0.8, like glucose to fructose or multidextrin to fructose ratio. But in addition, it's got 60 millimoles of lactate in there, which is roughly 5 grams of lactate. So the idea is this is a third fuel source that you can metabolize and help increase your uptake of carbohydrates for metabolism, just more energy availability for your muscles. So that's where,
Yeah,
where I guess, I'm not sure if it's where I first heard about it. I've heard suggestions of using lactate as a fuel source from exogenous
yeah.
source
Well,
before, but that's certainly where it hit the headlines, I would say.
yeah. I mean, there's I guess we talk about fructose and maltodextrin, or other types of, I guess, like sugar, but then there is also lactose, right? Is another form of carbohydrate, and there is a transporter for that. I think that's probably, in terms of a brief explanation of the mechanism, it's you're almost looking for these transporters that can transport each of these different types of carbohydrate from the gut into the blood, right? And the reason we sort of wanted to cover traditional fueling, I guess we're sort of traditional, even though it's modern, that we've got to this point where, we got to this point where we're rate limited if you just use one form of carbohydrate. And that's those sort of, say, older school gels where they are just, fructose. And you're rate limited per hour of the amount you can take of those. So then the next step is use two forms of carbohydrates, and then you can start playing around with the ratio of carbohydrates in those. And then I guess, being really reductive, this is just, okay, there's another transporter, let's use that. And I don't know, I don't know how many different transporters that there are to transport, from the gut to the blood and then to the working muscles. But you do feel like we're probably just going to go down the list of them and see what works, see what athletes can tolerate, right? But at the moment, generally a sort of, I guess, modern, or they get called like super gels, right? So something like Morton or Precision Fuel and Hydration, they're going to have two types of carb, and you're going to be able to go, well over 100 grams an hour if your gut can tolerate it. That's sort of where we sit at the moment. And then there's people that are really big outliers in terms of their ability to tolerate carbohydrates. So, what was Joe Klecker on at New York? Was that like, I want to say 180 grams, I think?
170, 180, something
Yeah.
insane is what he claimed to be taking.
Yeah, and then you get into the triathlon world where there's obviously race specific factors, like the fact you can't fuel during the swim, so you probably go a bit harder on the ride, and it's easier to fuel on the ride. But there's some of them doing over 200 grams an hour. So there are these massive ingestion rates that people are hitting now, and that's probably where we thought we were at London Marathon, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think just a bit of, a bit more background in the basics. Obviously, we want to take on, what we know is helpful to take on carbohydrates during exercise. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't spare muscle glycogen, but it does increase the amount of energy we're burning is coming from carbohydrate sources and not fat sources. So even if we're not sparing muscle glycogen, if we're burning more carbohydrates, we have a higher respiratory exchange ratio, and that basically means we need less oxygen to run at a given pace or cycle at a given power output. We're more efficient, basically, which reduces the work rate that we're at in terms of percentage of VO2 max. And traditionally, gels were literally just glucose. I mean, you can still buy those SIS go gels, which are just glucose. You might, which I wouldn't ever buy them unless they're really cheap, a bit cheaper, aren't they? So maybe if you're just looking for something to take on during training, maybe that's a use case for them. But traditionally, gels were just glucose, and the rate limit for that seemed to be about 60 grams an hour, and glucose is uptaken from the GI tract into the blood using a transporter, SGLT1. So at one point we thought the rate limit was 60 grams an hour because that's where we saturate these uptake transporters from the GI tract into the blood. Then we realized that fructose actually uses a different transporter, GLUT5. And if we do glucose and fructose together, we can get another 30 plus grams an hour in. So that's why we see now gels of glucose and fructose. But I guess the hypothesis is if we use lactate, which uses a different transporter, it's actually an MCT transporter, a monocarboxylate transporter, that seems to be able to take up between 10 and 25 grams an hour. So potentially adding lactate into the mix increases our ability to uptake energy sources for metabolism, because that rate limiter is the GI tract. It's getting it from the GI tract into the blood. And there are other ones, like you said, lactose, but the research on that is really not good. Lots of GI upset doesn't seem to aid performance, whereas lactate has potentially, at least theoretically, got a better use case.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of the current practice and some of the drawbacks, and again, this isn't super well researched, right? Like there's some research, but it's very hard to do. And there's definitely more coming out. There's generally always like a decent bit of nutrition work like every couple of months, right? That we inevitably send to each other. But at least at the moment, there's people doing these high rates of carbohydrate intake, but it's not a dose response relationship. So it's not a case of the more you take, the better the outcome. So that means, you're having to balance things like your GI response to it. Even if there was a dose response relationship, but you couldn't take more without throwing up, that's not going to lead to a better performance as such. But there's no linear increase in performance as you take more carbohydrate. And then there seems to be some suggestion that taking on exogenous carbs, so carbs that exist outside of your body, or outside of the stomach, I think is how that's generally termed, right, with carbohydrates. That doesn't seem to actually spare the endogenous carbohydrates that you've got stored in your muscles. So I think there's still questions about how taking on carbohydrate during exercise actually improves performance, because it's not sparing anything internally that you already, that you've got stored in your muscle and liver glycogen stores from a carb load. So it's still not completely clear, whether, at what point the high carb fueling tails off, and then also, I guess, the real mechanistic understanding at a gut and a skeletal muscle level of what fuel sources the body prefers and what's going on when you force these higher carb intakes. So it's one of these things where there's more and more elite runners and it being used in that applied setting, but the research hasn't necessarily caught up.
Yeah, I think like Jamie Pugh and people from that lab, what universities?
Liverpool John Moores.
Liverpool John Moores. They've done some nice work looking at 120 grams versus 90 grams an hour, and like you said, it's not a dose response. The more you take, the better. But they are showing advantages to taking 120 versus 90, and the old theoretical limit was 90 grams an hour, whereas we know of all these athletes taking way more than that, especially in cycling, but even more so but still in running as well. 120 doesn't seem that intimidating anymore. Quite a lot of people I know are taking that rate of carbohydrate and tolerating it well. But it does seem to be more about actually the more you take in, the more you burn, and the more you burn, the less you're using fat. And historically we would have thought that was a bad thing. I mean, we always used to be thinking about how can we get more fat adapted, so we're actually not tapping into our carbohydrate stores at all. We can just rely on our fat stores, which are plentiful. Even if you're a skinny runner with a BMI of 18, you've still got plenty of fat, and certainly much more adipose fat stores than you have carbohydrate stores in the form of muscle glycogen. But if you burn carbohydrates, you're more efficient and you can work at higher intensities. And actually, if you can just work at high intensity for longer, then you're going to be able to run faster. Obviously, fat is great in that there's plentiful stores, but there's a limit to how high you can push the intensity whilst relying on fat oxidation. It's just a much slower way of releasing energy for muscle contraction.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I guess that muscle contraction and the byproduct of glycolysis partly is lactate, right? So that's where we get onto lactate as a fuel source. And yeah, traditionally it was seen as a negative, right? That lactate was bad. Elevated lactate levels were bad, and they were what caused fatigue and task failure. But now the understanding is that lactate's actually a fuel source of its own that's actually liked by the body, by the brain and heart and skeletal muscle. And that's all been pioneered by a lot of work by George Brooks, who, if you read anything about lactate, you're going to see references to George Brooks's work, right? George Brooks and Inigo San Millan are sort of the two godfathers of
Lactate
lactate.
gurus. Yeah.
Lactate gurus, yeah. What title.
Probably unfair to call them a guru. They know what they're talking about. But yeah, I mean, that's why I think lactate is interesting as a fuel source, because we know that the body's already burning lactate as a fuel produced endogenously. And actually, lactate itself is just a partly broken down glucose molecule. Like glucose enters with glycolysis, which is the first part of the metabolism of carbohydrates. And one of the end products from that can be lactate, or it can be pyruvate. But pyruvate and lactate are very similar molecules. One of them goes into further on into the metabolism pathway, whereas lactate can be produced as a way to continue burning carbohydrates if we're saturating our ability to metabolize pyruvate. And we know that things like the lactate shuttle exist. So type 2 muscle fibers, those fast twitch muscle fibers, can produce lactate because they're less well adapted to completely burning lactate and converting it into pyruvate and fully breaking down that molecule to rip off the electrons. But lactate can then be fed out of those type 2 muscle fibers and shuttled into the type 1 fibers, which are fantastic at burning lactate. And we know that plenty of other organs within the body use lactate as a fuel all the time. The heart, the brain, and muscles themselves, as already mentioned, use a lot of lactate as a fuel. It's, like I said, basically just glucose that's been not completely broken down. So actually, it's very rational. There's a good rationale for thinking that if we exogenously give lactate, then that may aid performance, in that we know it's a fuel that's preferred by many of our muscle cells and other organs of the body.
Yeah, and I guess where we sort of got to in terms of our background reading for this podcast is probably a good starting point. There's a good paper called "Fueled or Fooled." Get that right? That's a bit of a mouthful. Examining the evidence and mechanisms behind ultra high carbohydrate intake in endurance athletes. It's by Dan Plews. It's from June this year, and they hint at, or they sort of have a whole section talking about they call it the carbohydrate to lactate interplay. And yeah, as you said, they mentioned the production of lactate, and then the shuttle and the ability of those type 1 fibers to use it. They also mention, and this is something we've discussed a lot, right, that the more you train and the more you do endurance training, you're going to have more of those type 1 muscle fibers and those lactate shuttle transporters. So that's the MCT1 and 4 that you mentioned at the start. And I guess it all links together, right? That's one of the big sort of themes behind the I guess, discussion that like Inigo San Milan talks about, isn't it? That you do lots of zone 2. I can't believe we're linking this to zone 2, but do lots of zone 2, and you increase the amount of those transporters that you have to actually be able to shuttle lactate out of the muscle, but potentially out of one part of the muscle into another to use as a fuel source. So I guess that then leads us on to looking at this as a fuel source for really highly trained athletes. If you've got more of those transporters to be able to shuttle lactate, maybe that also then means you're going to benefit more. So one of the things I'm already thinking with these gels is maybe they are going to work really well with really, really highly trained individuals. And we mentioned Yomif Kejelcha, who's run a sub 2-hour marathon. So he's obviously, one of the best runners of all time. These gels are also appearing at the Tour de France and being used by UAE cycling team and by Tadej Pogacar. So, arguably probably the best cyclist of all time, right? So they're probably going to be the ones that benefit the most if they have, the most amount of these transporters as well to actually be able to use lactate really efficiently as a fuel source.
Potentially, yeah, potentially. But I think it's also true of not just for lactate transporters. We know that if you are well trained, you're more sensitive to glucose, and your ability to be sensitive to insulin and quickly uptake glucose in response to high insulin levels is, it's just a better system in well-trained athletes versus general population. So I think it's probably the same with all of these fuel sources. And again, for the fit of a runner, higher the intensity, because you're running for shorter time, and especially when it gets to things like the marathon, where you can be 2 hours versus 3 hours of exercise. As in, if you're running 1:59 in the case of Kejelcha versus someone trying to break 3, you're out there for 33% longer if you're that 3-hour guy. And so the intensity is obviously going to be quite a lot higher for Kejelcha and the likes of those people running sub 2. And that means they're going to be more reliant on carbohydrates as a fuel source. And they just don't need to be out there so long. They can tap more into that system. So I wonder, I think the fueling, it's a hard one, isn't it? Is fueling more important for someone who's running at those faster speeds because they are actually running at high intensities, or actually are the people who are out there for 3 hours who potentially are less well adapted at using fats and just aren't so well trained? They need to be on top of fueling more to compensate for the fact that they're not so well trained. I don't know. It's just a thought in my head here, like who's actually benefiting the most from this fueling revolution. Down aside now, sorry.
No, and I mean, but this is all we have to go on, right? We have this paper that sort of hints at it, and that, like, I talk about it hinting at it. It's a section in a sort of wider paper with a couple of, not that this is bad side. It's just a couple of references and sort of some inferences, which is what this type of paper is there to do. And again, the suggestion I've heard, watching, again, at the time of recording, watching some of the Tour de France stages, is that there's some unpublished work that's being sent about. I haven't been able to find it. Again, by the time this comes out, that might be published, or it might have just made its way around the internet a bit better. But there seems to be some unpublished work about these gels, and especially the brand that UAE are using. I mean, that brand is Exolactate, and you can't get the gels. It's again, the thing that I'd heard is that the cycling team had bought the entire supply. So it's not like this is something that you're considering for a marathon in a few weeks, Dan, because you literally can't buy them at the moment.
It's a bit of a power move, that, isn't it? And even if it's literally placebo, if you think that you've got an advantage and the other team think they're at the disadvantage, then maybe when it gets to that breakaway, or that final push up the last climb, you think, I've got the edge here because I've got this special gel.
Yeah. I mean, it may have just been that they've just put this rumor out there and it's been picked up by the cycling media and it's being mentioned on every broadcast and written about, and it doesn't actually really exist. They might not be using it. They might just have normal, carb mix in their bottles. You just don't know, but I guess it's sort of, where we are, where there's unpublished work and white papers and then teams using stuff, and you have to decipher it. we have to decipher it as scientists, and the people listening that are consumers have to try and decipher that as well. And that's, I guess that's what we're trying to do with this episode.
Yeah. I mean, the Kejelcha stuff, again, is interesting. And obviously, just to make it clear, it's a different lactate gel company, Santa Marta. I butchered that pronunciation, I'm sure.
Sorry, Spanish listeners.
Yeah, apologies. But they've got some interesting case study stuff. And it sounds like they were quite involved in all of his nutritional prep in the final 12 weeks into the London Marathon. But they really make the point that Kejelcha's a petrol. He's come from the track. He's running like near world record times over everything from he had the world indoor record for the mile at one point, but he's also running just outside the world record in the 5K and running world-class times over 10K, and had the half marathon world record at one point. Maybe still does, because the one by Kiplimo wasn't ratified, I believe. Anyway, so world-class over the half, but they were worried about how he would convert into the marathon. And apparently they've done some testing with him. Some of the videos and clips they've got on their website show some pretty dubious equipment, which I wouldn't be using to assess a world-class athlete. We'll move on from that. So it's how much you take away from these numbers and these case studies, where obviously they're trying to market and sell a product, aren't they? You can't be naive here. But you can imagine that economy would have potentially been one of Kejelcha's weaknesses, and if you targeting that through nutrition makes sense. We know that if you take on more carbohydrates, you're going to be more economical, all other things being equal. But then they even publish his whole nutrition plan in terms of the carb load, the day before, what products he's taking, and the in-race stuff. But certainly from a website, at least, it doesn't seem to include in his race day nutrition any of these lactate gels at all. He's using other gels from the same company, but they're not the lactate ones.
Yeah. I mean, that confused us doing the prep for this, right? There's no lactate gels. It mentions that he had 4 cups of water, but no lactate gels. I'd say we'll link it in the show notes. It's an interesting case study. It's cool to see stuff like this. As you say, some of the equipment, it's interesting. But we went through the products and we were both on the call, and we were like, there's no lactate gels here. So, again, where has it come from? The information that led to articles and press releases about this, because that's sort of how we even got to this page, was I think Marathon Handbook had quite a big article about it. But if you read the case study, he didn't take any of the gels. So
at least during the race, there's mention to something pre-race. So 6:15 a.m. on race day, and the race started at 9:30 from memory.
Yeah,
a prototype.
You were on the start line behind it, right?
I know. I can't remember what time it started now. That was weeks ago. I was stood next to Kejelcha, not quite next to him, a couple of rows back.
Should have asked him.
He's so lanky. Lanky. Should have asked him. There's reference to his prototype, 750 ml, that he's drinking in small sips from 6:15 a.m. onwards. But then the gels they're using are pretty standard glucose fructose gels, a bit higher in sodium, some caffeine intake there as well, taking some drink mix as well, but he actually missed 2 of the 3 bottles, I think, that he was supposed to be taking. So that didn't seem like it held him back too much, considering around 1:59:41, I think his time was. So there's a lot of uncertainty around what's actually happening. And I imagine it's the same for the tour teams. We don't know what rate of this lactate gel they're consuming and how much, and if they've actually tested it in training and got any data themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, on Santa Madre's website, they don't sell a lactate drink mix. So, again, it says prototype. Maybe that's what he took. Or maybe just put the gels into a drink mix. Like you say.
So you could see how it could be
Yeah.
lactate, including lactate. So
Yeah.
surely they've claimed that he's taking lactate. Somewhere must be a claim on the website that he took lactate. I mean, first thing you see is 1:59:41. How we delivered the best marathon debut in history.
Yeah. I mean, like even just searching the page, there's no mention of lactate on the case study. So yeah, I don't know where it's come from. But
Slightly
yeah, and I
bizarre.
mean, we did want to briefly talk about the the gels and drink mixes he took in the race, right? Because like interestingly, they had polyphenols as well. So the gel that he took had tart cherry juice in, which we've discussed. We just discussed polyphenols in relation to New Zealand black currants, and yeah, if you go back and listen to the episode with Sam Shepherd, he talks about what polyphenols are in a lot more detail. But yeah, I guess that's also interesting that tart cherry juice is something that I don't want to say traditionally because it's only really the last like 4 or 5 years, but is being used again as a supplement to have directly after high intensity work. So again, at the Tour de France, you'll see a lot of the cyclists finishing a stage and immediately having tart cherry juice. But then it's interesting that he's taking it during the marathon. So there's
But also
yeah,
in the day before, it makes reference to him using this unusual nitrous product,
mm,
which contains 1,800 milligrams of nitrate, some sodium bicarbonate in there as well. But then, 750 milligrams of polyphenols, of which 650 milligrams are anthocyanins, which are exactly the same as what's in this New Zealand blackcurrant supplement currants that we've been using as well. And there's good evidence for that to help with muscle recovery, but potentially the carbohydrate loading process as well, and our ability to store carbohydrates as muscle glycogen. So yeah, I mean, it sounds a little bit like this company's just throwing the book at it, and anything that's got some evidence will chuck it in. But also a rationale to it as well, like nitrates. Yeah, there's good evidence behind it. Polyphenols, yeah, reasonable evidence. But um, yeah, it's it's a messy world, nutrition. So should we move on to some actual papers?
yeah. Let's go through again the limited evidence we've managed to find.
Yeah, again, like I made reference at the start, there's not a lot out there, uh, but there are a few papers of a mixed bag. There's quite a lot of stuff in mice models, which are a nice starting point, but obviously you can't pretend that mice are humans and certainly not human marathon runners. Um, so let me find that first paper here. So let me start that again. Acute administration of exogenous lactate increases carbohydrate metabolism during exercise in mice. And this was from 2021 by Jiang. And it was published in Metabolites. And in this study, they looked at the effects of exogenous lactate administration before exercise on substrate utilization during exercise. And that's quite interesting. But a lot of these papers are giving the exogenous lactate before exercise instead of during the exercise, which makes me think, well, maybe that prototype that Kejelcha was taking was where lactate was entering his system. They were just doing it pre-exercise, which doesn't really make sense to me because lactate is metabolized and absorbed very quickly, potentially even quicker than glucose and fructose. So I don't know why you would give it beforehand, but they've done it in this study, and potentially Kejelcha was too. Anyway, they divided the mice into a control group and a exogenous lactate group, with a placebo for the control group. They measured respiratory gas during moderate intensity treadmill running. So they were basically looking at the oxygen consumption, CO2 production. And they also looked at some mRNA, which is messenger RNA, which is basically looking at the signaling response to exercise from the blood, liver, and skeletal muscle of these mice, which is obviously why it's good to do. Well, it tells us different stuff in mice studies because obviously you can't very easily go and get the mRNA from the liver of an exercising human. Right? That's probably frowned upon ethically, and sadly we're allowed to do that to mice apparently. Anyway, so they looked at 16 and 30 minutes into exercise, the expiratory exchange ratio and the carbohydrate oxidation levels were significantly higher following the lactate supplementation. So higher levels of carbohydrate oxidation, peak was 0.014, and a higher exchange ratio, which again means we're burning more carbohydrates, peak was 0.045. So that's interesting in itself, and you can infer that potentially that is going to help exercise performance.
Yeah,
I think
I
that's
guess.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to take the next bit of work, which at least is in humans, right? This is Bordoli et al. In 2024, and this is effects of oral lactate supplementation on acid-base balance and prolonged high-intensity interval cycling performance. And this is from the Journal of Functional Morphology and Kinesiology. And again, yeah, they're looking at the use of lactate as a supplement during high-intensity cycling. So yeah, 16 cyclists with a VO2 max, or mean VO2 max of 59 mils per kilo per minute, so pretty well trained. And yeah, they either had 120 milligrams per kilo of body weight of lactate or a placebo. I don't think it said what the placebo was, but I don't know. Would it be sugar, or would it just be nothing?
Saline, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that was 70 minutes prior to exercise. So again, like you were saying, if lactate is metabolized very quick, that's probably far too in advance. And when we're talking about these gels that have been taken during an event, that's obviously a completely different use 70 minutes before, right?
I'm sure there must be a reason for this, though. I'm sure they're not doing it just because. There must be a rationale for taking it an hour or so before the start of exercise. I just don't know why. I just don't know what that rationale is.
70 is really specific as well, isn't it? Because you would just think, oh, just do 60. Like you just do an hour before, because that's, pretty straightforward, right? But, if you're starting the test at 10 o'clock, you just take it at 9. But, 70 is quite specific. So it does raise that question. And yeah, they did their exercise test was 5 blocks of 1 kilometer and 4 kilometer time trials with 10 minutes of moderate intensity cycling between. So they found there was no effect of the lactate supplementation on performance, but there was a reduction in RPE and positive changes in acid-base balance. So yeah, they reckon there's an alkalizing effect from taking lactate, and that's contributing to a reduced RPE, but there's not a clear change in the actual performance during that exercise, and that's obviously quite high intensity, repeated intervals. So not going to be a direct correlation to a marathon where you're maintaining a fairly sustained effort the entire way. I was on the sidelines in London. I didn't see what they ran, but I don't think it was a ridiculously slow and then a slow first half and then a massive kick down. I think they were just going for it from the start. So it's not quite the stochastic nature of a cycling event. It's and that study doesn't necessarily reflect a marathon, but yeah, interesting.
But it is long and hard, isn't it? I mean, how long is a 4 kilometer time trial going to take a cyclist? What?
I mean, probably 4 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say 4 or 5 minutes, isn't it?
So
depending on the level of a cyclist.
It's sort of like 10 minutes easy, 1 minute on, 10 minutes easy, 4 minutes on, times 5, right?
Yeah, 5 times about 25 minutes. So so it's like 2 hours basically of cycling, which is a good duration. There's a lot of intensity in there. So in that regard, I think it's actually a good protocol. I still don't understand why they choose some of these protocols. Why have they gone 1 kilometer time trial and a 4 kilometer time trial interspersed by 10 minutes, 80% and 90% of the gas exchange threshold? I don't understand why they're mixing up the different distances, why they're throwing time trials in like that. But anyway, it's hard to know. I think so. As long as it's repeatable, it's fine.
I guess they may be looking at like the drop off of the 1K and the 4K performance across those 5 bouts, right? So but then I don't think they've reported the results of that. So I guess there wasn't a drop off, but then I don't know. I feel like you would expect that, right? Like if you've got to 2 hours, I know, cyclists will ride for a lot longer, but you've got to 2 hours in and you're doing a 4K TT, presumably there would be a change in
No, I think there was a
performance.
drop off in performance.
Yeah. And I mean, this was one of my thoughts with these gels was, okay, do they have an impact on your durability? Is that the direction to go in? Do you need to do some durability trials? So this sort of does get to that point with, that protocol. But yeah, it's definitely way more cycling specific than endurance running.
Yeah. But it's interesting, isn't it? But RP was lowered, but performance was the same. I mean, you'd think, well, if they found it easier, they could push harder.
Yeah, you would have thought so, right?
You
But then
would
I
think
don't
so.
know. There's a few studies like that. Some of the cooling stuff I think is similar, right? That you have a lower RP, it doesn't necessarily improve your performance, but you're more comfortable, so you're probably going
Yeah.
to do it still.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that's basically I think that's the best study there is in terms of the amount of participants and the rigorousness of the study. And, I mean, I would like a marathon to feel easier. And if there's no side effects, I'd potentially take it. The next study was similar in humans as well. So the influence of acute oral lactate supplementation on response to cycle ergometer exercise, a randomized crossover pilot clinical trial, bit of a mouthful, that title, and that's by Ewell et al. 2024 and published in Nutrients. So in this study, they gave oral lactate supplementation, double-blind, randomized, as I've said already. I got 15 athletes, 9 males, 6 females, who were either ingesting a placebo or a commercially available lactate supplement prior to cycle ergometry exercise. And they basically did there was 2 parts to it. They did a physiological assessment for VO2 peak, ventilatory thresholds, and work rate of a lactate threshold. And they then did a 20-minute self-paced time trial on a bike. And this was an interesting one in that the lactate supplementation didn't seem to influence the physiology in terms of VO2 peak, the ventilatory threshold. So the VO2 at the ventilatory threshold, so that basically means at what percentage of their VO2 max did their threshold occur, or the work rate at their lactate threshold, they were all no difference between placebo and the lactate, exogenous lactate. But then there was a 4% improvement, p value 0.02, in terms of their power output during the 20-minute time trial. They're obviously not very good athletes, or not. They're not super highly well trained. I'll be careful how I say this. I'm still not super highly well trained because the average power outputs for the lactate group were 204, and the placebo group was 197. So they're not of the caliber of Tour de France athletes. They're not completely untrained either, but I think most. Yeah, we'll move on from that before I start.
Sorry if you took part.
Yeah. But I think the time trial stuff, that's not a big difference, is it? 204 versus 197 watts.
It's probably biological.
And these aren't experienced athletes, obviously. They're not super experienced athletes. And there's going to be differences between time trial performance. So you could see how that would be an artifact finding. Because in my mind, but maybe, like you said earlier, Owain, you'd think that having a third fuel source is going to be more beneficial in the longer events versus a 20-minute time trial, where you're not going to run out of muscle glycogen in a 20-minute time trial. And you're not going to be inhibited by your energy utilization. Doesn't mean it's not true. I don't think maybe it just means that maybe lactate isn't working in the mechanism that we thought it might be working.
Yeah, I know it's really simple, but I wonder if people just think more lactate is produced during shorter efforts. Let's, shorter, high intensity efforts. Let's use it during that, and then. but then now it's come about that it's being used in the sort of longer end of endurance efforts, and in the heavy intensity domain rather than severe intensity domain. How does it work there? So yeah, I wonder if it's as simple as that. I guess also a lot of like foundational sports science stuff was like repeated sprint and shorter efforts as well. Cycling, like cycling trials. Thinking of the stuff like back in like the sort of 70s and 80s. So maybe that's just where we are as well. Is you just do repeated sprints on a bike, or 20-minute all out time trial on a bike, because it's just a bit easier to do, and that's where you start. And then in a few years someone will do the durability sort of protocols that are being used now that are a lot more complex. But no, it does raise questions, doesn't it, why it's these shorter things.
Yeah, I mean, I think my sort of takeaway is there's sound theory for why taking lactate could be performance enhancing in addition to glucose and fructose, or mostly extra fructose. But at the minute, we just haven't got enough research to say one way or another if it is beneficial. I mean, they are basically all the papers we could find on exogenous lactate, and it's looking at its potential to improve exercise performance. Whereas if you looked at the same but for carbohydrate, you would found thousands and thousands of papers, and we can be pretty convinced that, carbohydrate intake is going to aid exercise performance, certainly in the longer events. But you're only looking at small differences in performance. It's not going to turn you from a 2:30 marathon runner into a 2:20 marathon runner taking carbohydrates. Maybe it's worth 5 minutes, I don't know. But I don't think it's worth 10 minutes, fueling versus non-fueling. And then lactate itself, as an addition to that, is going to make an even smaller performance, give you even smaller performance advantage, you would imagine. So just a handful of papers isn't going to be enough to tease out, is it making a difference or not?
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. Like it's easy. Well, I think it's almost becoming more common that people are skeptical about supplements and claims that are made. I don't know, or maybe that's just my algorithm. But I think at least with both of these, there seems to be, I would say both of these in terms of exolactate and Santa Madre, there seems to at least be on their websites like a willingness to do research. I mean, exolactate, like that's the main thing on their page, is like, if you're interested in research, like collaborate. You obviously don't know what then goes into that, and there's a lot of what's the right way of putting it? Like, you always need to look at who's like funding research and all of that once you get a paper out. But it's at least interesting that that's sort of the point we're at. But at the same time, you do need to be skeptical to a degree about what you're reading in mainstream media, because like we said, the article about Kejelcha about these gels, but then the plan or the fueling plan that's published on their case study doesn't have them taking them. So what's going on there, you don't really know. There's something being sold at the end of it. It does raise some questions, right?
That's why I hate nutrition stuff. It's just a minefield. It's a minefield. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It is interesting, and it has actually, it's probably the area we've progressed the most in, I think, in terms of of how sports science can aid performance. But it's just messy. And there's always somebody trying to make money because you've got a product you can sell. It's harder to sell intensity distribution or high intensity interval training and stuff like that. People are giving it a go, but it's less marketable. Whereas nutrition is so obviously easy to put a price tag next to it. Yeah, I think the other thing will be interesting is just looking more about lactate outside of its use as a fuel source. Because lactate, like we now know, it's got the abilities to act like a hormone, and there's a dedicated lactate receptor, which is called GPR81. I had to look that up. Don't know about off the top of my head. Knew there was one, but yeah, GPR81. That exists on lots of different tissues. And for example, it's part of a feedback loop so that this receptor exists on adipose cells, so fat cells. When you get high levels of lactate, it will bind with a receptor on these adipose tissue cells and basically tell the cell, stop lipolysis, stop breaking down fatty acids for metabolism, because we're now in carbohydrate burning mode. We're working at high intensity. If you release the adipose, if the adipocytes start releasing fatty acids, we're not going to be using them. So that's just a waste. Instead, we're going to be using carbohydrates. So that's a example of lactate working more like a hormone rather than just simply being something that we metabolize as fuel. And there are these receptors also exist on cells and neurons within the central nervous system. So there definitely could be examples of lactate working in lots of different ways, but we just don't know about yet. So maybe it does signal within the central nervous system, within the brain, to reduce our perception of effort, for example, or to enable us to just work harder or push harder because there is fuel in the system. I don't know. I think it's still a really interesting area. Lactate is signaling pathway and how it actually does influence performance.
Yeah. There's loads of questions, isn't there? There's how does it work? What dose should you take? When should you take that dose? Yeah.
Because there were papers out there looking at the effects of infusing lactate and just the influence on our metabolism just at rest, and how that's influencing our ability to or our shift in fuel source metabolism to more carbohydrate and lactate and less to fat. And there's stuff out there on muscle recovery, and there's some interesting bits in the periphery, but nothing that cohesive in terms of there's not been a real push in a particular research area, which makes it then hard to draw out good conclusions from this is what the literature says. That's always difficult, but at the minute, there really isn't enough of a focus in one particular area to give clear takeaways.
Yeah. And I guess because we've not necessarily done a similar episode in terms of the topic, the supplement, but a few weeks ago we talked about taurine, right? And I think there was maybe I don't want to say better, but because it wasn't like gold standard for recommending a supplement like you get with, say, caffeine. But there was a bit of a more applicable evidence base to endurance sports, right, with taurine. And there was still only a few papers, but there seemed to be it seemed to hint that there was a benefit even if the mechanism still wasn't understood. Whereas this, I don't think has even reached that bar yet. So if we're comparing it to another supplement that we've recently spoken about, it's not even there, and that's a long way off. And the taurine stuff, one of the papers we were talking about there was a pre-COVID paper, right? I think it was like 2018. And that's how far that field has gone. And obviously, there's a lot of other factors in terms of the funding and the potential impact. Like if taurine's going to have a 1% impact on performance, but maybe these lactate gels have a 3% impact. The lactate gels will get more research, but that's further ahead than these gels, and we were still quite skeptical then about using it. So yeah, and that's something where you just take it before and seems to do its job. Whereas taking lactate as a fuel source, if you got given some of these gels, would you know when to take them? It's sort of forget the cost, forget actually sourcing them. Like, when would you take them? During? Would you take them before? Would you take a gel 70 minutes before London Marathon? Like, I don't think I would. I think that's probably actually, for me, in my mind, like that's too close for like a dose of carbohydrate.
I'm looking at the Santa Madre website now and seeing what they say there, but says activation time 7 to 10 minutes. Directions for use: high intensity, less than 3 hours. Take one gel immediately after you warm up. If the effort lasts longer than 1 hour, take one additional gel every 40 minutes. So
Yeah.
even though even in their instructions, they seem to be suggesting taking it before exercise if it's less than 3 hours.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
But again, obviously it's still got glucose and fructose in there as well. It's
Yeah.
also, how do they interact as well?
Yeah. That was my
Uh,
next thing.
mhm.
If you take it every 40 minutes, but on the other, you're taking a gel every 20 minutes, like, and that gel's got caffeine in, how is that going to interact?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, and it's also in theory that glucose, fructose, and lactate can all be taken together, and that's not going to interfere with the absorption rate. But none of those papers were doing that. They were all just looking at lactate in isolation, because
Yeah.
that's obviously got to be a starting point, isn't it? Does lactate work by itself? And then maybe the later stages are, well, does it increase performance above that, which is inferred by taking a glucose fructose gel?
Yeah.
It's one of
Well,
those where the marketing is way ahead of the evidence base.
yeah. And yeah, if someone from Exolactate or Santa Madre wants to come on and chat to us, we'll definitely talk, because we're really interested. Like, if again, going back to the sort of starting point, there's a supplement that's been used to run a sub 2 hour marathon, or used in, during a sub 2 hour marathon, and by the best cyclists in the world. Like, we would like to know what's going on, like, just to, for our own curiosity, right? Let alone, yeah, as a discussion point for a podcast. So we're definitely interested. We'll definitely be, if we see a paper about lactate gels, we're probably going to be reading that one pretty quick. That's going to the top of our reading list.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Maybe, I don't know. It might not displace some of the Bath studies for me, but it'll be near the top.
They have got other athletes using this as well.
Mm,
There is. I'm just looking on their website. They've got their photos mixed up. They've got a photo of Kejelcha. They've labeled it Tamara Widman, uh, and that's definitely not the right person. But
yeah.
they have got trail athletes, ultra runners, cyclists who are taking this. Apparently, they've got like 5 different athletes called Tamara Widman who are taking it as well, judging by their website. They've obviously
I,
mucked up a little bit there. I don't even know who
yeah.
Tamara Widman. Anyone? Do you know who Tamara Widman is?
I was going to say, I think it's being used by the Solomon Elite Trail team maybe as well. So,
Uh,
that obviously getting into the really longer duration stuff there. So, yeah, some interesting uses. We'd like to know more. Because, yeah, there isn't the evidence base at the moment, for us to
she's
understand
a
what's
World
going
Cup
on.
mountain biker, if you wanted to know, from the Austrian Alps. So from Austria.
Yeah. So that's
There
going
you
to be,
go.
40 to an hour 20 long efforts for, assuming it's cross country mountain bike. Um, yeah. And again, that's going to be more stochastic. So that paper is actually a bit more relevant to her, the 1K and 4K on offs. Yeah. But no, we're speculating here because that's all we can do at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. Watch your space. I think
Yeah.
it may be something, or it may not. I'm hesitant to say it'll. I don't know which way do you reckon it's going to go. Do you reckon this is we'll forget about it in a year, or we're just going to be talking about it more and more for the next 5 years?
I think we'll be talking about it more and more. Yeah. I think there's
Do you
enough,
reckon
like,
next?
not quite connected people looking at this, that
Yeah.
it's not just one team. It's not, like, we always use this as the example, right? But like NN using the continuous glucose monitors for a bit, and then they disappeared once the sponsorship ended. Like,
Mm.
that was clearly a commercial partnership. Whereas, yeah, there seems to be enough, a couple of companies and with different athletes in different sports involved. I think there's probably something there,
Mm.
but
Yeah, I
we're
imagine
guessing.
lactate is very cheap as well. It's like you get lactic acid in so many food products. It's a preservative, isn't it? So I'm sure we don't know what form they're putting lactate into their gels. It's going to be either sodium lactate or lactic acid.
Hmm.
But anyway, it's it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah, we'll leave it
Should we
there
leave
for
it
now, I
there?
reckon.
Yeah, I think so. We've run out of stuff to
Nice.
talk about lactate.
Until next time, I guess.
Next time, until we
Yeah.
speak about it for another hour.
Cool.
Thanks
Nice.
for listening, everybody.